Zovets is a Ukrainian political analyst. He joins me now live from Kyiv. And thanks so much for being with us. So, you've got these exercises in Belarus, the increased activity in the Black Sea. Some people have called Putin's actions calculated brinkmanship. But how do you see it? Do you see it that way in terms of what he might do and the risks of miscalculation or misunderstanding?
Yes. Good morning, Michael. I think the problem with Vladimir Putin that he's sending the mixed signals to the world. On the one hand, he meets yesterday with Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov and Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu and saying that there's still a room for diplomacy. But on the other hand, we see these military drills continuing on our border. I mean, not only territory of Belarus, also territory of Transnistria, occupied Crimea and others, not to mention Russian Navy blocking Ukrainian seaports. And I think that the goal which Mr. Putin is pursuing in this game is to get victory without military action. He wants to get concessions from Ukraine. He wants to get concessions from United States and NATO without attacking Ukraine. And I think that this diplomacy of Mr. Putin seems to be quite successful.
Yeah. We heard the Ukrainian president make it clear, very clear, that he still wants Ukraine to be in NATO. His words were, yes, we would like to join NATO as it will protect our integrity. And that is the key issue here. But what does Mr. Putin think when he hears a comment like that? Is it helpful at this time?
It's a very good question, Michael. You're absolutely right. Yesterday, Ukrainian ambassador to Great Britain, Vadim Prystaiko, former foreign minister, made comments in BBC 5 Live stating that Ukraine may drop NATO membership, and this might work to find any sort of compromise with Russia. But the problem with Mr. Putin, he do not accept that sort of concessions. I believe that Mr. Putin and his henchmen behaving within a subculture of St. Petersburg of 1990s, where they would like to intimidate and humiliate their partners. And only after that, they sit on a table of negotiations. And I think from this perspective, any concessions made by Ukrainian, like dropping NATO perspective, would not help to compromise with Mr. Putin at all, which would only mean to Mr. Putin that Ukraine and West are weak. And from these points, Mr. Putin will push much more forward against Ukraine. And in terms of military actions, if you're asking, it wouldn't stop any military actions. He can actually withdraw this time. He can do this in March. But the problem, there would be next build-up, and build-ups more, even by the end of this year.
Yeah. And I wanted to ask you, about Putin's fundamental complaint, and that is NATO encroachment towards Russia's borders. When you think about it, the United States wouldn't want an adversarial military alliance near its borders. I wonder, what do Ukrainians think about Putin's position? I mean, does he have a point about NATO getting close to Russia?
According to the Ukrainian polls, 81% of Ukrainians have negative attitude about Mr. Putin. These polls were conducted by the end of 2021. Majority of Ukrainians are definitely in favor of joining NATO. As you might know, Ukrainian parliament made amendments to Ukrainian constitution, and now Ukraine is seeking NATO and European Union membership. And I think, actually, if we're talking about Mr. Putin's fears of Ukraine, Georgia, Moldova, and other former Soviet republics joining NATO, these basically the same fears which communist leaders used to express in the 1980s. Then they said there were two clash of civilizations, literally, Soviet bloc and so-called NATO or Western bloc. The problem with Vladimir Putin that is his rhetoric's actually stuck in a period of 30 years because the world has changed. Central and European countries like Poland, Czech Republic, Baltic states, they are now enjoying their life within European Union and being NATO members. And I'm absolutely sure Ukraine at some point would be also NATO member. But for Vladimir Putin, this would be very harmful to even think about possibility that Ukraine, the country which he says, well, he denies even the right of Ukrainian people to be a separate nation. So for Vladimir Putin, the whole perspective of Ukraine joining NATO seems to be a nightmare.
Yeah, we're almost out of time, but I wanted to ask you this. I mean, taking a country in a purely military sense, when you have a superior, huge and capable military, that's not the hard part. But as the Russians saw in Afghanistan and the Americans certainly did in Iraq, the taking isn't the same as the holding of territory when there's a hostile population, almost certainly an insurgency. How do you think Ukrainians would react to Russians occupying?
They would react with fierce opposition. They would fight for their country and they would fight for their freedom, because these are actually the values which Ukrainians are dying for. I can remind you only that we're in a state of war, undeclared state of war, of course, with Russia for the last 8 years. And since then, more than 14,000 Ukrainians, both civilians and military personnel, have been killed by Russians and their proxies in Donbass. So it doesn't change anything. Ukrainians are ready to meet Vladimir Putin and his hordes here on the territory of Ukraine. And I think that President Putin and his ally Alexander Lukashenko of Belarus underestimate the fact that in case if this war starts, it will end in definitely defeat of Vladimir Putin, and at some stage, it can also affect civil unrest in Russia or even civil war.
Right. A great analysis. Taras Berezovets in Kyiv, thank you so much. Appreciate that.
My pleasure.